The email arrived at 11:42 at night, sent to me by mistake from my ex-husband's solicitor instead of his own. A single attachment labeled Fiona Dating Scan for Scheduling Reference, sitting quietly in my inbox between a grocery delivery confirmation and a reminder about my daughter's parent-teacher conference. And by the time I finished reading the gestational dates printed at the bottom of that scan, my hands were shaking too hard to hold my phone steady. My name is Amelia, I'm 33 years old, and 8 months ago I moved my 4-year-old daughter Zara from Lahore to Manchester. A decision that cost me nearly everything I had, financially and emotionally, following a divorce from my husband Daniel that had already cost me most of what remained. Daniel and I married 6 years ago, a match our families had been thrilled about, 2 respected families joining together, and for the first 3 years whatever cracks existed between us seemed manageable. The ordinary friction of 2 people learning to share a life. Zara was born 4 years ago, and I believed, the way new mothers often do, that her arrival would settle something unspoken between Daniel and me, would anchor us more firmly to the life we were supposed to be building together. It didn't. Daniel began working later hours almost immediately after Zara's birth, business trips that grew longer and more frequent, a distance I attributed for far too long to the ordinary pressures of a demanding career rather than anything more deliberate. I remember specifically the month Zara turned 6 months old, thinking with something like relief that Daniel finally seemed to be settling back into himself after what I'd assumed was simply new father adjustment, not understanding until much later that his easing tension had nothing to do with adjusting to fatherhood and everything to do with something else entirely occupying his attention. I found out about Fiona 18 months ago, not through any dramatic discovery, but through the mundane, almost anticlimactic way most affairs actually surface: a hotel receipt left in a jacket pocket, a name I didn't recognize, a pattern of late nights that suddenly made a different kind of sense once I started looking at them honestly instead of explaining them away. The divorce itself took nearly a year to finalize, contested at every turn by Daniel's family, who insisted, even after the affair became undeniable, that I was the one destroying the family's reputation by refusing to simply overlook it the way they implied more than once generations of women before me had apparently managed to do. My own mother, to her credit, never once suggested I stay, though even she, in her gentler moments, worried aloud about how difficult it would be raising Zara so far from everything familiar, a worry I understood but never once let change my mind. I refused, filed for divorce, and made the decision, once it was finalized, to relocate with Zara to the UK, where my sister had lived for years and where I had, after considerable effort, secured a work visa and a position with a marketing firm in Manchester that allowed me to build something entirely my own, away from a family and a city that had made unmistakably clear whose side they'd chosen once the marriage ended. Daniel had agreed, reluctantly, to the relocation as part of the custody arrangement, structured visitation that brought Zara back to Lahore 3 times a year and brought Daniel to Manchester twice, an arrangement that felt, most days, like a fragile but functional peace after the considerably uglier fight that had preceded it. What I hadn't fully anticipated was how quickly Daniel would move on publicly, announcing his relationship with Fiona to family and mutual friends within months of the divorce finalizing, a timeline he'd always framed, both to me and apparently to the family court handling our custody arrangement, as beginning only after our marriage had definitively ended, a narrative I'd found painful but had, largely, accepted as at least technically accurate, since I'd never had any concrete evidence proving otherwise. That email changed everything. The dating scan attached to it, meant for internal scheduling purposes between Daniel's solicitor and Fiona's own legal representative regarding some unrelated matter, included, as these documents routinely do, the gestational age calculated from the scan date, a simple mathematical fact that placed Fiona's conception date squarely 11 months before Daniel and I had finalized our divorce, and, considerably more damning, only about 6 weeks after I had given birth to Zara. I sat with that math for a long time that night, running the numbers over and over, hoping I'd made some error that would soften what they were actually telling me, and finding each time the same unbearable conclusion. Daniel's relationship with Fiona hadn't begun after our marriage ended. The way he'd told me, the way he'd told our families, the way he'd apparently represented to the custody proceedings that had determined how much time he'd continue seeing our daughter. It had begun while I was still recovering from childbirth, while I was awake at 3 in the morning nursing our newborn daughter and believing, in whatever exhausted, hopeful way new mothers believe things, that my marriage was simply going through an ordinary rough patch rather than actively dissolving behind my back. I want to explain why this particular detail, more than the affair itself, which I'd already grieved and moved past in the 18 months since discovering it, undid me so completely that night. I had built an entire understanding of my marriage's timeline around a specific, if painful, narrative that Daniel and I had genuinely tried, that whatever had broken between us had broken gradually and mutually before Fiona ever entered the picture, that the affair, however devastating, had been a symptom of a marriage already ending rather than the active cause of ending it. That narrative, however painful, had at least allowed me some dignity, some sense that the marriage's failure hadn't been engineered specifically during the most vulnerable period of my entire life. The dating scan took even that away, replacing it with a considerably uglier truth, that Daniel had begun an affair with another woman while his wife was still bleeding from childbirth, still learning to keep a newborn alive on 4 hours of broken sleep, still, in every meaningful sense, entirely unprepared to defend herself against a betrayal of that specific magnitude. I contacted my own solicitor first thing the following morning, a woman named Priya who had guided me through the entire divorce and custody process with a patience I'd relied on more than I probably ever properly thanked her for, and explained what I'd received. She was quiet for a long moment on the phone, and then told me plainly that this discovery, if verified and properly entered into evidence, could have significant implications for the custody arrangement currently in place, not because infidelity itself typically affects custody determinations directly, but because Daniel's sworn statements to the court regarding the timeline of his relationship with Fiona had apparently been false, a material misrepresentation made under oath during proceedings that had directly shaped how much time he'd continue seeing our daughter, and under what conditions. What followed was nearly 2 months of legal proceedings, considerably more complicated than I'd anticipated when I first opened that misdirected email, Priya formally requesting verification of the dating scan through proper legal channels, Daniel's solicitor initially attempting to argue the document had been misdirected and shouldn't be admissible, a position the court ultimately rejected once it became clear the scan's authenticity wasn't actually in dispute, only its implications. There were weeks during that period where I heard nothing at all, waiting on filings and responses that seemed to move at a pace deliberately designed to test my patience, and weeks where updates arrived daily, each one requiring me to relive the same timeline again from a slightly different legal angle. Daniel, confronted directly with the timeline in a deposition Priya arranged, initially tried to argue the relationship with Fiona hadn't been physical or serious until after the divorce, a distinction that grew increasingly difficult to sustain once Fiona's own solicitor, apparently unwilling to have his client's credibility dragged into Daniel's attempt to minimize the timeline, confirmed through her own sworn statement that the relationship had, in fact, been fully established well before Daniel and I separated. I want to be honest about what I felt during those 2 months, because it wasn't simply vindication, though there was some of that too, watching a man who'd spent our entire marriages ending insisting I was the difficult one, the unreasonable one, finally forced to answer for a lie he'd told under oath. Mostly what I felt was a strange, complicated grief, grieving not the marriage itself, which I'd already fully let go of, but the version of my own history I'd been carrying for 18 months, a story where at least the timeline of my own suffering had made some coherent sense. Learning that Daniel had begun building a new life with another woman during the exact weeks I'd been most vulnerable, most exhausted, most entirely dependent on believing my marriage was still worth fighting for, forced me to grieve an entirely new layer of loss I hadn't known was still waiting for me. The custody hearing that followed, once all of this had been properly entered into the court record, resulted in modifications I hadn't specifically sought but that the judge determined were warranted given Daniel's demonstrated willingness to misrepresent material facts under oath, additional oversight provisions regarding his visitation schedule, and a formal note in the court record regarding his credibility that Priya assured me would matter considerably if any future disputes arose. Regarding our arrangement, Daniel's family, who had spent the initial divorce proceedings insisting I was destroying the family's honor by refusing to overlook his affair, went conspicuously silent once the actual timeline became part of the public court record. The specific irony of their earlier insistence on preserving appearances now considerably harder to maintain against documented evidence of exactly when their son's affair had actually begun. Zara is 4.5 now, thriving in ways I try not to take for granted given everything the last 2 years have cost to secure for her, settled into her nursery school in Manchester, building a small, sturdy world of her own that has nothing to do with the complicated adult history that produced it. She still talks to her father regularly, still visits Lahore according to the modified schedule, and I've worked hard, even through everything this last discovery cost me emotionally, to never once let her feel the weight of what her father did or the timeline of exactly when he did it, because that particular grief belongs entirely to me, not to a 4-year-old who deserves a relationship with her father unclouded by details she's far too young to carry. I think often, sitting in my small flat in Manchester some evenings after Zara has gone to sleep, about the specific cruelty of learning your own suffering had an audience the entire time, that while you believed you were simply weathering an ordinary difficult season, someone else was already actively building the next chapter of their life around your absence from it. I think about the specific weeks it happened, weeks I remember with unusual clarity precisely because they were so hard, the sleepless nights, the healing body, the fierce, exhausted love I felt watching Zara sleep against my chest at 3 in the morning. And I have to hold two truths at once now that used to be separate, that those weeks were among the most tender of my life and simultaneously, the exact backdrop against which I was quietly being betrayed. But I think, too, about what that misdirected email ultimately gave me, not just legal leverage in a custody arrangement, though I won't pretend that mattered less than it did, but a kind of clarity I'm not sure I would have found otherwise, a final, undeniable confirmation that the version of events I'd been quietly doubting myself over for 18 months had been true all along, that my own instincts, dismissed for so long by Daniel and his family as paranoia or unreasonableness, had actually been reading the situation correctly the entire time. My sister told me once, sitting with me in my kitchen the week the court proceedings finally concluded, that she thought the hardest part of what I'd been through wasn't the affair itself but the years I'd spent afterward second-guessing my own memory of what had happened, and hearing her say it out loud made something in my chest finally loosen that had been tight for far longer than I'd realized. That confirmation, painful as it was to receive, gave me something I hadn't fully had since the divorce began, permission to stop questioning my own perception of what happened to my marriage, and to build whatever comes next for Zara and me on a foundation of truth rather than a story I'd been quietly, generously editing in Daniel's favor for far longer than he ever deserved.